Welcome to Secure Ideas webinar for getting started with the CIS controls. For those folks that are looking to secure their small or medium enterprise, hopefully this webinar will give you a good indication of how you can get started with that.
All right.
So starting off, a little bit about myself. My name is Jon Knepp. I am Senior Security Consultant for Secure Ideas. Secure Ideas is based in Jacksonville, Florida, and has been operating since 2010. I joined just last year in 2020, and I'm based out of Denver, Colorado. My background is in system administration. I started off back in the 90s doing software support and have spent a good bit of time growing up through IT infrastructure, doing architecture, and various for various industries, oil and gas, healthcare, financial, and big data. So been across a wide range of companies of varying sizes. And actually that's why this particular topic is of interest to me. Worked for small companies and had to deal with not having a lot of resources. And then I've been at very large companies with very robust and very large structures and teams of people that are addressing these things. So it's given me some interesting perspective as I bounce between the two. And then outside of work, my interests include small batch home brewing. That's something that keeps you busy on those long stretches at home during the pandemic. And then I'm also an aspiring empty nester with 2 adult sons who, because of the pandemic, have failed to leave the house in some months. And then my wife likes to say, my last interest here, my wife likes to say is probably one of the best midlife crises anybody can hope for. I have a small dog that occupies the remainder of my time and allows me to kind of fill the hole that, well, supposedly an empty nester would normally bring.
Nice.
Now it's just a crowded house. So.
All right. On to me. So my name is Jason Gillam. I'm the Chief Information Officer at Secure Ideas. I've been with Secure Ideas since 2013, so quite a long time, and have, prior to that, had a fairly lengthy career in a combination of software development, enterprise architecture, application architecture, and application security. I'll just leave it at that. So I'm located in Rock Hill, South Carolina. So that's near Charlotte, for everyone who doesn't know where Rock Hill is, because that's, fairly small town. I'm an IANS faculty member. I've done, I spent a lot of my time doing penetration testing and programming as well. And some of that also, well, at least the programming, I've done a lot of that on the side as well. So you kind of see that in my open source contributions. If any of you are familiar with Burp Suite, so it's a web application testing tool. I've written multiple add-ons for that, and also gotten involved in a few other things. I am also a home brewer as a hobby, and I love games. I really like gaming of all kinds. So card games, board games, and video games. So as I mentioned, what we want to do here is we want to help get you started with how to secure your organization, or at least if you have started and you're kind of wondering, okay, well, I'm kind of doing it haphazardly. How do I get this under control, and am I doing all the right things? So to get started with that, really what we want to do is we want to start with that question of, okay, well, if you're responsible for your information security in your organization, then what is it that keeps you up at night? Like, what are the things that that you worry about. We joke a little bit especially in roles like mine, where you have such a thing as a resume writing event, and none of us really want to experience any of those. That might be something that keeps you up at night. So looking at small businesses, the specific threat landscape is not that different from larger businesses. But in smaller to medium businesses, you're always going to have a certain set of things that we worry about in information security. So one of those is the theft of information. And it's not just any information. It's going to be whatever information you are protecting, whatever's important to you. And it depends on the company what that really is. Sometimes that's customer records, and you'd be worried about those getting stolen. Sometimes it's a secret formula or patented information, or basically whatever you hold dear as your company. What is important to you? That's what you might be concerned about getting into the wrong hands, that could ruin you or make life very difficult. Another is, I kind of bundle all of this under embarrassment, but it's basically your inability to conduct business normally because you've been impacted by some sort of event that is caused by a malicious actor. So, and that could be a website defacement. Somebody's got in and hacked your website. Or a really bad one would be a distributed denial of service attack, which might prevent, let's say, your e-commerce website from being able to service customers, right? So if you can't service your customers, then how, for example, on an e-commerce site, how are you going to be able to continue to conduct business and make sales if the site's offline? So that's another thing that might concern you as well. Phishing attacks. So according to Verizon's, I forget what they call it, the data breach investigations, something or other report. So they come out with this report every year that kind of breaks down based on information that they've gathered on various different incidents and breaches. And phishing attacks is still considered the top threat action, and as of 2020, the top threat action for actual breaches. So, of the breaches that occurred within their data set, phishing was part of more of them than any other type of threat action that took place. So it's a big deal. It's part of a lot of attacks. Right. So you might be concerned about, how do I protect myself from phishing attacks? How do I make sure that my employees don't fall victim to these? Another really big one is ransomware. It's not just hitting big companies; that's hitting small and medium companies as well. And so this is that idea that you're an attacker or group of attackers is leveraging malware that basically locks up all your files and encrypts them on your systems. Now, a larger organization may be equipped, or at least one that's thought ahead, may be equipped with a mechanism to restore those files and get back to business very quickly. But in smaller to medium organizations, especially where security has not yet been a priority, you might not have a good system for backing up all of the things that need to be in play and backed up. And so if you get hit by ransomware, you don't have a lot of options to resolve that, right? So that's something else that you might be worried about. Data loss. One way to think of data loss is not necessarily an attack. There's other things that can occur that don't involve a hacker coming into your system. It could be, your experience a fire in your building. Or a tornado rips through your data center or something like that. There are natural disasters or man-made disasters, as an example, that could result in you losing important data. So we're not talking about data getting stolen at this point. We're talking about data just getting gone. It's lost forever. Or it could actually just be an accident, right? And maybe it's not a natural disaster at all. It was somebody pressed the wrong button and deleted a bunch of files or database rows accidentally. And if you don't have backups and stuff in place, then that can put you in a bad spot. So those are the main things I think that there may be others. Feel free to throw other ones in the chat if you can think of anything else that you might consider a big concern that keeps you up at night. So this kind of leads into what we want to really talk about today, which is the main problem is big, like larger or well-funded organizations with security teams that are robust and mature in their processes and whatnot. Even those are getting hit by a variety of different cybersecurity issues and events, and we see them in the news all the time, right? We'll see. I'm not going to start naming them because I think the list just goes on forever. But pretty much any day you can look in the news and you'll see, oh yeah, there was another data breach. Somebody got a bunch of usernames and passwords or credit card information or whatever it was out of some company that you might even recognize or have done business with. It's just really, really common. So it begs the question of, well, what could if the well-funded security teams are having these issues, then what can a small to medium organization possibly do with a very limited budget and very limited staff, especially as well in that case? And that's kind of where this comes in. So where do we start? You have to start somewhere. Now, maybe you've already started, so you could skip this question. But for a lot of organizations, it's you're seeing this stuff in the news, or maybe, worst case, maybe you've already been hit by something, and that's kind of opened your eyes to, wait a second, doesn't matter that I'm a 10-person company. It's still, I'm still a target for these horrible things that could happen. So where do you start? And the very first thing you should be thinking about, and we'll get into the CIS 20 in a minute, but the very first thing you want to think about even before you get there is you need to determine, what do you value? And by that, what I mean by what do you value is, what does your company value? What are the things that some of it might be, your proprietary information or your secret formula or what have you. And in other cases, it may be things that you are required to value because of regulations, right? You need to be able to continue to conduct business. So let's say, for example, you handle cardholder data. So if you're handling cardholder data, then PCI DSS requires that you follow certain steps. That you protect that data. You have to protect that data, and you have to value that data, or you will lose your ability to continue to conduct business with credit cards, for example, right? So what you value can vary, and it's usually not just one thing. You have to think through, what are all of the different things, your different types of assets that you deal with in business, and how those what are the things that you really want to be able to protect? And then you can work out a plan for how to protect them. And that's really what we want to talk about. So the CIS controls, currently it's a 20 security controls. That's changing soon. And John's going to cover how that change is going to occur. But I'll start with just talking about, what it is, because I think that the real goal behind this it doesn't change at all, even with the new version. So it's a recommended set of actions. I'll just read off the quote here. It's a recommended set of actions for cyber defense that provides specific and actionable ways to stop today's most pervasive and dangerous attacks. So basically it's if you're doing all of these things right, then your risk of being the victim of an attack drops dramatically, right? in the industry, we never say your risk becomes zero or we never say something is 100% secure, right? There's always a room for error, because just when we think we know everything about something, we discover how little we really know, and then there's some other new attack vector that hasn't happened before. So we always, we always leave a little bit of space, no matter what you do. But there are a lot of things that you can do, a lot of basic steps that you can put in place, and many of these are not costly from a money perspective. They will take some effort and thought, and maybe developing processes and whatnot. But from a pure, you don't have to invest necessarily thousands and thousands of dollars in software solutions to cover a lot of what is inside the controls, as you'll see. So it's basically, it's a guided journey. It kind of walks you through, okay, well, let's do these things first, and then do these other things, and then do these other things. So as we go through the next few slides, you should be thinking about, where do you fit in that journey? You might already be partway down that path. Maybe you have to take a step back and cover a couple of things that you should have done earlier in that path. Or maybe you're ready for the next step. So with that, I'm going to pass this back to John, and he will take it from there.
That's a good lead in. A lot of, you kind of seeded a lot of points that I will definitely be expanding upon here. The first being, that the CIS controls are adapting and have been changing to address the fact that the threats out there, and that our actual IT, the cyber security space has been evolving over time. So the controls that you put in place need to evolve as well. The way you approach it needs to evolve to address the changing landscape. And that can seem very daunting at first, especially when you don't have a team of security professionals on staff addressing these things. Or in some cases, some of you in the audience may actually be part of the business and not really IT focused. There's a lot of people out there in smaller organizations that have just as much need to secure and protect their data and their systems, but they don't have a dedicated staff. They're interested in finding out, how can we get started on this as well. And that's what that's one of the nice things that the good things about the way CIS, the Center for Internet Security, is approaching these controls and kind of the maintenance and evolution of these controls. So some of you, if you've been around for quite some time, may remember the SANS top 20 critical security controls. Those were the origin of the CIS controls, and I'm going to try and use the term CIS controls instead of CIS 20 or CISC 20, which, as you can tell, it's been 20 for a very long time, since it was SANS top 20, but that will be changing, and we'll get to that a little bit later on. As of today, we're currently still on the CIS controls version 7.1. So there have been a lot of evolutions. The controls are essentially, it's organized into groups of controls and subcontrols. The subcontrols are really what you're implementing. The controls are kind of a broader organizational heading for them. So your subcontrols are meant to be actionable and measurable and focused on a single action. So that's really kind of the power of it. And there are a lot more subcontrols. I mean, we're not just limiting to 20. The groups that each of those subcontrols belong to are limited to 20, but the number of subcontrols in there really ranges from 10 to, I think there might be some, I want to say that one of the controls has like 40 subcontrols underneath it. But really it's a list of, here are the things you can do to mitigate your risk. So we'll talk a little bit more about how those are organized. The most recent version of the controls, version 7.1, and that in that release, they implemented, or they introduced a new concept of implementation groups. And this, I think, we'll see as we walk through these slides, really was a kind of a paradigm shift in the way that they're presenting the controls and introducing people to them, because it now gives organizations a way to prioritize the implementation and understand how best to get into these controls based on your resources and your risk level. Some of these implementation groups, the lowest implementation groups will be something everybody does, whereas the latter implementation groups will be depending on the size of your organization and your level of risk and the sensitivity of the data you're protecting. You may not need to go quite that far, and that structure is something that the Center for Internet Security really that's evolved these controls into something that's much more approachable. So let's switch to the next slide. So the original controls, or I should say the controls themselves in the groups, they're organized into 3 groups. We've got the basic controls, which are the first 6 controls. Again, they've got sub-controls underneath them, but the theme here for the first 6 is they're the key cybersecurity controls that every organization should be looking to implement. That's the basis upon which everything else will build. And that includes things like asset and hardware inventories, controls around securing permissions and handling users. And so those are things that every organization should be doing. Then when you move up into the controls, the latter controls, 7 through 16, those are the foundational controls that are essentially the best practices, security best practices, that as you kind of get more mature in your your security organization, your security teams and your security stance. That is what you're going to be implementing some more advanced controls. And then finally, the final set, the 17 through 20, those are focused on organizational controls. So things like doing disaster recovery planning, establishing software development, security practices, doing penetration tests, and planning for incident response. So these are kind of the larger sort of organizational efforts that go towards people and process changes that will improve your security posture. So moving on to implementation groups, this is where the evolution and the next version of the CIS controls will carry this a step further. The evolution of these controls really is starting to open it up to organizations of different sizes, and to help provide guidance for organizations of all sizes. They've broken up the sub-controls really, because every organization will need everybody's going to need something from basic and probably foundational and very likely organizational as well. But not all of the sub-controls will necessarily be relevant for every organization size. So implementation groups were a way for the controls to be sort of prioritized so that a little bit of each of those controls or the sub-controls from each control area are prioritized for organizations based on the level of risk that organization may be faced with, as well as how many resources. You're not going to go out and buy some of the really advanced security platforms out there if that does not, if what you're protecting and the size of your organization doesn't support that. But that doesn't mean there aren't controls within those groups that you shouldn't be looking to implement, even if you are of a smaller size. So the implementation groups are designed to give you a guideline for which controls you should focus on as you move up that scale of risk. So the first one is really the first implementation group here, which are the essential protections. Those are the controls that this webinar will concentrate on for the rest of the webinar, and give you some strategies for how you can get started implementing some of those controls. And we're not going to talk specifically about each control, both because version 8 that's due out here in the not too distant future will be changing up the numbering anyway, but we're going to give you an idea of how to approach the concepts, and then we can point you to the resources so that you can familiarize yourself with the individual controls. I see there was a question there. How are CIS controls mapped to open? Well, we'll talk about that in a little bit. All right, moving on. So, full disclosure here, this 3-phased implementation I'm going to be talking about is actually, there's a CIS controls guidance paper out there that actually talks in depth about this particular topic, this approach. It's really very, very simple, and I decided that this is, there's no sense reinventing a wheel. This is a good introduction, a good on-ramp to the controls. So 3 phases, and it's as simple as this: know your environment, protect your assets, and prepare your organization. And in that order. So we're going to dive into that. Phase 1, know your environment. So some of the questions you'll want to be thinking about in here. Do you know what is connected to your network? Do you know what software is installed on your systems and networks? And do you know where your most important data is being stored? So this goes back to what Jason mentioned before. What are you trying to protect? And how are you going to know when you're being attacked, or where your risk is if you don't know what should be there, right? So you have to understand your network so that you know what devices should be connected. That used to be pretty easy, pretty straightforward, and it may still be for some people, but things like the addition of Wi-Fi networks and VPNs have made it a little more complex these days. When you had to actually plug a cable into the back of a computer, it was a little harder to sneak an unexpected device onto the network. Now, that's not to say it wasn't done, because I know many times in my career, I would be surprised when I looked underneath someone's desk and found that there was a little hub down there that was not officially supplied, and there were other things being plugged into it. So, a little bit of shadow IT going on. Knowing what's out there and what should be in your environment is an important step to knowing, or to being able to identify what is anomalous, what shouldn't be there, and what could be a risk. So, software systems, same thing. Bigger space and perhaps a little harder to gain visibility, because you're having to dig into each of the individual systems to know what's there. And if you're not logging onto those systems, do manual inspection. How are you going to accomplish that? And then, of course, last, where is your most important data being stored? You've got to know where it is so you know how to protect it. So what are the activities around this? So phase one activities, inventory and control. You've got to take stock. And they, Jason mentioned, you don't have to go out and spend a ton of money to do this. There are free options and fairly simple options to get started on this. If you haven't if you don't have a list of your current hardware and software assets, it's a little bit of elbow grease to go out and catalog all that, but you can get started with something as simple as putting it all into an Excel spreadsheet. I actually did this at a company not too long ago, and yes, this is coming from a large organization. I'd come from a large organization where we had a very robust CMDB, configuration management database, and everything was scanned and with automated tools and populated. And then I moved to a small organization where we did all of our asset and inventory information in a spreadsheet and did so manually. Yes, I ended up developing a couple of scripts to try and make sure that those inventories were kept as current as possible, but it didn't really require a lot in the way of expenditure. It is an essential step, however. Without the inventory, it's going to be very hard to identify what does and does not belong there. And that's key to control. So want to point out, we're not just talking about hardware and software inventories. We also want to make sure we catalog our sensitive assets, so critical and sensitive assets. And I also put on here services, some things that with kind of the introduction of cloud, we need to understand that not everything that's essential for our business operations are going to be on our network. Some of those things will be external. Some of our business operations will actually require connectivity to things like, well, let's be honest, Office 365. There are a lot of companies these days that are pretty much unable to operate when Office 365 is down. Their outside communication is cut off. Even internal communications rely on that. So those external services, you need to identify that so you know what to protect or what your risks are. It means you might not be protecting something, but understanding what the impact of the absence or the unavailability of that service is important to knowing how to address the security concern that presents. So periodic audits, that, as I mentioned, that's important to make sure you've got current information about your inventories and your catalog of assets. And then control. So once you've got your inventory, you have to make sure that you're addressing anything that, any anomalies that pop up. Unauthorized hardware, that's simple. Somebody's connected something to your network or to your Wi-Fi, for example, that shouldn't be there. You need to keep track of that so you know when there's something anomalous pops up, you can research that and address it. Make sure that if something's not supposed to be plugged into a network, you've unplugged it, or you change your Wi-Fi password because you've seen that there are devices that are showing up that should not be there. And then more importantly, software. Making sure that software that isn't authorized, that isn't part of the normal business operations, isn't installed on machines on the network, so that it could potentially pose a risk. You're not looking, your business operation is focused around the maintenance and security of the software that you need to do business. If you have other software on that being installed on your systems and network, that could pose a risk because you're not paying attention to it. Best option here is to restrict access so that people can't install software that isn't authorized for use. Control the ability to install that software. And then along those same lines, restricting and in effect, cataloging who has access to what. It's important to know who has elevated privileges and how they're using them. So you want to make sure that you're enabling auditing, that you're keeping track of who can use privileged access. And Jason will probably be talking about this on one of the upcoming slides. Make sure people understand when it's appropriate to use elevated access, because it's that elevated access that increases the risk. So moving on, Jason.
Thanks, John. Okay, so as we move into phase 2 of the the what is it called, implementation groups?
Yep. Well, we're still just talking about implementation group 1, but this is kind of the adoption, getting started.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So as we get into phase 2, what we're talking about here is, now that you've identified everything, basically, is how do you start protecting those assets? So there's questions that you should be asking yourself, like, are you setting up your computers with security in mind, or is security really more of a Band-Aid sort of approach, right? Because that's very common. If you're doing that, you're not alone. You wait till something goes wrong, and then you decide, oh, wait a second, maybe we should be installing antivirus on all of these computers. Do you manage who has access to sensitive information or who has elevated privileges? Another common issue, especially in smaller organizations, is everybody is an admin. And that can cause some very serious problems. We know from when we do penetration testing that when we run into that sort of scenario where there's too many people with elevated privileges, it becomes very easy for us to gain a foothold onto one system and then use that to gain elevated privileges and pivot to, often it's the rest of the network very quickly, if that's not set up right. So that might be, another thing that you'd be thinking about. And then the last one on here, I think is absolutely a key thought on there is do my users even know what they're supposed to do? Like, what role do they play with respect to cybersecurity practices? Every user should have or feel some responsibility for cybersecurity. If they are dealing with sensitive information in any way, then they're responsible for keeping that data secure and following the processes and policies and controls that you've put in place. So some of the activities around this that kind of fall into the phase 2 are secure and inform. Those are the two big ones, right? So first of all, on the secure side, how do you secure systems? One of the first things that you can do as an activity is establish what is your secure baseline configuration for things. And really what this means is you need to make sure that that you have a documented set of, when we build a new machine, and it could be a laptop, it could be setting up a network device, it could be setting up a server. You have a set security baseline of these are the basic things that we'll always have installed, right? And then think of it kind of like a checklist. Now, as you get more mature in your processes, you may completely automate that process of doing your builds. If you're not quite there, that's okay. You just go off of manual list. Make sure that I have these pieces of software installed, that updates are working, that certain accounts are on there or not on there. All of those configurations, you come up with, what is the secure configuration that I want, and use that as a baseline for everything you build going forward. That also gives you a great way for down the road. Once you've established that, down the road, you'll be able to use that as sort of like an audit checklist to make sure that all of your devices are still following their baseline, or if they fall outside of their baseline, then that can be a red flag for, hey, something's gone wrong with the system, or maybe somebody's attacking it or something like that. So it gives you information.
Yeah, just want to interject there.
Yeah.
For those folks that are looking for help with respect to what to secure, how to walk through that setup, I mentioned before there may be people that are viewing this webinar that are maybe not IT centric or have limited resources. The CIS, the Center for Internet Security, has some companion guides, and we'll have links to it later in the slide deck. A couple of those companion guides that would fit really well here. There's one for CIS Controls for Microsoft Windows 10 cyber hygiene. That one is actually targeted to companies that may have zero servers in their environment, no central policy pushing solution, and it has a kind of a walkthrough of what do you do to create a hardened guideline or a hardened build for your workstations. And then there's another one for small, even like small home offices, a small office, home office networks. And it walks you through not just how to configure the devices, but even a guide on, how to buy off the shelf. What do you look for? And then once you've bought it, what do you make sure that you do to make sure that you're in a secure position with some of this commodity, the commodity solutions out there?
That's a really good point. So when you're trying to figure out, okay, what do I want to use as a secure baseline? CIS doesn't just have the 20 controls. They actually do have, like John said, there's basically kind of like cheat sheets basically for setting up baselines. So you don't have to start from scratch, which is awesome. And those are, I believe, all of that stuff's free.
Yep.
To
free.
download, get your hands on. Yeah. You might have to give up your information to see it, but I don't know.
Yeah.
And then you have, so the next thing on here, ensure all operating systems, browsers, any malware software are kept up to date. So basically patch all of the things. Right? We always talk about that. Keep patching the things. When there's a, quite often there are security patches that are passed out to your software that they might not be that important. Maybe it's some sort of corner case or something that's really not a big deal. It could be a low level vulnerability, but there are also the really, really nasty ones as well. So it's important that you stay on top of that so that you catch the nasty ones. And then, unless you are big enough that you can keep an eye on like every single patch that comes through, some organizations actually have teams dedicated to doing that. So they can do a lot of analysis ahead of time to see, hey, does this particular vulnerability impact me? And which is a valid question, which we should be able to answer. But in the absence of that, just having a very, very regular, very frequent schedule of updating, things like your browsers, operating systems. A lot of that's happens automatically these days, so we don't really have to think about it. Just make sure it's not turned off. Your employees don't have the ability to turn off those automatic updates.
I will mention that looking through the implementation group 1 controls, the only two, automation is for the most part kind of in implementation group 2, but the idea of keeping your OS and software updated, those are the two exceptions to that. Those are considered, you've got to make sure this is this is basic cyber hygiene. Make sure your updates, that you've got automation for that.
Yeah, good point. Next one, strong password policies. Can't stress this one enough. Referring again back to the Verizon data breach investigations report, I want to say it is, actually have it scrolling over to the side here. I can't find exactly where it is now on there, but it's I want to say it's still over 30%.
The 1 in 5, is this the
1 in 5? Yeah.
Yeah.
So one in five of the breaches that occurred and with the data collected in 2020. So that may have been data for 2020, and then I don't know if some of it goes in the previous year, but still 1 in 5 of those were because of credentials being used, stolen credentials being used, or credentials that were guessed being used, right? So having a strong password policy is really important. I think the single most important thing that you can do with respect to passwords is if there is an option to use multi-factor authentication, the little Google authenticator where you have to type in the 6 numbers when you log into something. If that is an option for any of the software that you're using, and it's very frequently an option for cloud-based software, then that should be required by everybody. When that's enabled, the strength of the passwords that people choose is less important. It's still important, but it's less important by quite a bit than when you don't have multi-factor authentication, right? So it can make a really big difference as to how easy it is for someone to make use of a password that they've stolen somewhere. And the rest of it's strong passwords, long passwords, use passphrases instead of words, that sort of thing. Use encryption to protect sensitive information systems, right? So you should be, data in transit. Most common factor here, of course, is using HTTPS instead of HTTP for applications. That should be the norm these days. Yeah, so that pretty much covers the secure part. Next section is inform. So really, some of the best detective controls that you have in your organization is your people, right? They're the ones who, you can set up alerts for things, which is good, but your people are going to notice when something doesn't seem quite right. And so they need to have awareness training to know, first of all, how do they recognize when something doesn't seem quite right? And then what do I do with that information once I see something that doesn't look quite right? Which that could be something as simple as I received an email that I suspect might be a phishing email. In my CFO is asking me to act outside of our normal process to get this payment in place. And that seems kind of weird because he emailed me on a Sunday, which, usually he calls me instead of emailing me. So that just seems, those types of situations should automatically be, hey, this is a red flag, something's not right. And they should know what to do. So you want to kind of develop that security minded culture within your organization, right? And then also the users need to have very clear instructions on how they're supposed to access and handle any sensitive information that they're handling. And that has implications across many different industries, and just, in general, it's a really good practice for all organizations that deal with sensitive information, which is just about everyone. So phase 3 is preparing your organization. So some questions to ask yourself. Do you know when the last time your critical files were backed up? Do you know? Like, is there a schedule for that, or is this something that just happens sporadically when you think about it? Do you periodically verify that your backups are complete and can be recovered? Right. So maybe you have a backup process, but somewhere along the way, something broke that process. And so the process is still happening, but it's being interrupted or not completing properly, or the data can't save. One of the biggest issues that we've seen in the past with this is the disk was full. So I'm backing things up to from location A to location B, and the disk space on location B is exhausted. The disk is full. So the backup's happening, but there's nowhere to put the backup because there's no space left. Seems like a really stupid, simple problem, but it's been a very common one in the past. You still see it sometimes now too. And lastly, do you know who to contact if you do have an incident? Right, something happens. Everyone in your organization should know, who do I contact? Who do I talk to? So plan and prepare. So planning. This one I can't emphasize enough. You need to document what is your incident response procedures. I would actually expand this even further, and I don't know if this is in another section, but think about incident response. Like, when do the things that are small things that can rapidly become big things, what are you supposed to do with those? The same applies for things like having a disaster recovery plan and business continuity planning. Like, those are all planning things. None of these are require you to go out and buy expensive software. You can write these plans out in a note document, or even jot them down on paper if you really need to. But all of these are important to document, because when you're in the middle of an incident or disaster, at that point, people tend to panic and they're not really sure what to do. So if you don't have this documented, that's when mistakes happen. People do the wrong thing, or ignore the wrong thing, or take the incorrect action. So make sure that you have your plan documented, and the steps, the procedures that need to be followed. You also want to identify, like, who's ultimately responsible. What leadership is responsible for handling incident response? So if I see something that seems strange, and let's say I'm a manager, an IT manager in a company, I need to know, at what point, what type of incident am I supposed to notify my CIO or CEO or whoever? Like, who am I supposed to notify, and at what point? And so you also need to maintain contact information, of course, for anyone who needs to be part of that notification for internal or external incidents.
I think it's also important to mention here, and I know that certain people that gravitate towards IT will hate this, myself. You're going to have to start talking to the business and engaging the business in these types of activities. It really will require their buy-in and their participation to make sure that you're doing this effectively.
Yeah, good point. And then last part on here is preparing. So things that you can do to prepare for, when things might go wrong. Weekly backups, or more frequently if you can. Depending on how you're set up, you might be able to do daily backups of your systems. But you need to perform very regular backups, and then have a process for testing those backups and recovery to make sure that, hey, the backup process is working and I'm able to restore from a backup if something goes wrong. And that'll become that could become really important for just about, most of those things that I said, what keeps you up at night. Many of those things, having good backups is one of the single most important steps of preparation that you can have in place. If you get hit by ransomware, if you have a good backup system in place, you may be able to back up restore from those backups, and get your systems back online without even having to deal with your ransomware person. If you lose data accidentally, somebody presses the wrong button, being able to back up from that's great. So it's a really important step, and one that's often missed and not really covered very well in earlier stages of InfoSec programs. And then you also need, another one is for preparing is publish those instructions. So make sure that internally your employees know how are they supposed to report anomalies and incidents, anything that seems abnormal. How are they what are they supposed to do with that information? So, all right, I'm going to move on because we're running a little bit low on time.
Yep. So we've teased this throughout the talk today. The timing of our webinar happened to coincide or come really close to the release of the next version. So I actually attended a webinar on Tuesday morning, kind of talking about the upcoming changes in the CIS Controls version 8. So they're officially scheduled to release on May 18th. They have been the controls, the categories, as I mentioned, the 20 has actually been reduced now down to 18 and reorganized. So now they're going to be known as the Essential 18, which I think is really cool. Sounds a little bit like a Quentin Tarantino take on the CIS controls. So instead, and if you've looked at the CIS controls in the past, you may have kind of been befuddled about why did they decide to order them this way. And then the implementation groups kind of muddle that a little bit more, because you're like, well, I'm just picking and choosing from each of these categories for implementation group 1. So I'm spreading it out across all these control groups. Well, now they're actually going to be organized around activities. And the indication is that those activities that they'll be listed in order of kind of what you do first and progressing downward. Don't quote me on that. It just seems to be the impression with the way that they kind of talked it up during the webinar. And then finally, so really and interestingly enough, they admitted that the CIS 20 had a lot of duplication. For instance, there was a control that dealt with inventorying and managing your hardware assets. And then the next one was inventorying and managing your software assets. And there were so many of the controls that were almost exactly repeated, except substituting the word software for hardware. So the duplication, they removed a lot of duplication. They actually got the controls down to 17 controls, but they added a new one in, focused around kind of that cloud, the rise of cloud and service providers. So there's some controls around governance and evaluating, your cloud and security stance, or your cloud and service provider security stance. So that's a new one to look out for. I'm very excited to see that. And I will be hitting download as soon as it's available on May 19th, May 18th. I'm on vacation on the 19th. I won't be reading anything that day.
All right. So that pretty much ends our session, and it looks like we're right about on time. I would point out that we have a couple of upcoming training classes. One, if CIS 20 is something that kind of rings a bell with you, and you don't have your CISSP at this point in time, that's something that you're looking for, you should take a look at our mentor program for that. On our training site, and that is one class that is a pay what you can class. So if you're looking in your pocket and all you see is lint, then we can probably make something happen there for you. It is a 9-week self-study program that we kind of help you out and do a bunch of webinars and training and stuff for that. So. And then we have if application security is your thing and you want to get into some application security hacking, then we have our professional evil application security class starting June 9th. We also have a couple more webinars, one on the attack framework and the other one on security controls for Amazon Web Services. So if that's your thing. And then there's some resources at the bottom of the slide as well. So
the URL there, just grab that one and all those other companion guides that I've got bulleted underneath there. Those are available, and many more at that link. But I kind of highlighted a few there that seemed like they would be a great fit for anybody that's just getting started, looking for a little extra guidance. And the top one in the list there was, as I mentioned, the one that kind of based loosely our framework of the phases around. So,
good. If there aren't any other questions, we'll finish up. I do want to address the one question. I'd answered it directly in text, but the question was let me read it. Yeah. How is CIS Controls? How did CIS Controls map to OpenSAM? So OpenSAM is from the OWASP project, and it is it's actually around securing your software development. So it is not quite an apples to apples comparison with CIS 20, but you could take aspects, probably a lot of what's underneath OpenSAM, and that would fit within parts of CIS 20, the parts where you're dealing specifically with applications, and that's applications from designing them all the way through to deploying them is all covered within there. So, all right, thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.